I'll take it on first. With respect to the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, it's important to note a couple of things. One, it is a formulaic-based program. It's tied to what's called the State Transit Assistance Program, which is by share to cities and counties and operators directly for transit services. The utilization of these funds still have to show a greenhouse gas emission reduction benefit, and that goes through a process that involves ARB. So I want to make that clear. But I also want to say that some of the very things that you mentioned were awarded in last year's process, particularly things like free fare days for transit access. There was projects for bicycle access programs as well that were funded through that. Last year we did $24 million through that program. 95 projects were awarded statewide.
And those are for bicycle loan programs?
I want to look more specifically, but there were bicycle beneficiary programs, and I can go through what they were. I think there was rideshare and some other things involved. And I can look at that and get back to your office on those specifics. But of the 95 projects that were done last year, 64 were identified in benefiting disadvantaged communities. But they did include some of those very things that you mentioned. I would just add to that, Winston did a nice job, Randall did a nice job of going through the process that the Strategic Growth Council is now undertaking to do technical assistance in a similar way, but not as quite directed. After our first round of the transit grant program, we undertook to travel around the state a little bit and talk to both winners and losers in the program about what worked and what didn't work on the applications, and we're trying to apply that to the second round. Under the statute, we put up our guidelines for 30 days on the website and then have 2 hearings, one in Northern California and one in Southern California, and we've tried to incorporate what we heard in our informal workshops in the latest round, and so now those guidelines have been adopted. But it's that same kind of learning process that we're all trying to incorporate, even though we have different starting places and we have different programs. So I just wanted to say that, and also say that, again, with respect to the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, there were some grantees that received funds for specific projects that you mentioned.
Thank you.
And I would just say, Senator, that I know that we worked very closely with the SB 535 Coalition, which was representative of a large number of environmental justice organizations when we came up with the initial investment plan, and that's how we understood the significance, for example, of doing weatherization projects to provide more energy efficiency in housing stock in disadvantaged communities. And we continue to do that outreach to try and work with communities. So I know that we've got car sharing programs that we've been looking at the Air Resources Board in the Barrio-Logan area, portion of San Diego. There's a program that we've worked on with the Community Housing Development Corporation in Richmond that would help with financing of purchase of zero-emission vehicles. As I noted, we're looking at what we can do to provide greater incentives to allow low-income families to buy zero-emission vehicles in the area of the South Coast Air District and also San Joaquin. And so there are a variety of programs. So we're moving in that direction, and we're always interested in getting new ideas. I'll also mention that at Cal EPA, we have an environmental justice small grants programs. One of the purposes that the grants can be used for is to do community capacity building. And so there are a variety of programs, if we can sit down and talk to folks who are interested, that we can put together that will enable organizations and communities to participate in some of these programs. And then we're always looking for ways to reach these programs out.
I'll maybe just add a few thoughts to that, and maybe starting back to when we awarded the first round of grants for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program in June of 2015. Immediately thereafter, we held workshops, listening sessions, really, with community members, stakeholders, folks who'd applied in the first round, folks who didn't, folks who were unsuccessful, and frankly, heard much of the same thing. We revised the first set of guidelines throughout the summer, throughout another series of intensive workshops. At the same time, Cal EPA in partnership with ARB and the other administering agencies held workshops on the second investment plan. And so also heard a lot from the community, again, touching upon many of the issues that you just raised. Some of the new pieces that we have in our guidelines for this year directly, I think, address some of your concerns with regard to anti-displacement strategies, new points and criteria associated with community benefit and community engagement, addressing depth and level of housing affordability, and other elements. We had another set of listening sessions and workshops after we released draft guidelines in October, and then we approved the program, or guidelines rather, for the current round in December. But all of that being said, and recognizing that I think for, at least in terms of SGC's program, it's an iterative process, there is also still the concern of, folks being prepared to apply in the first place. A month or so ago was down in Los Angeles, touring one of the projects we funded in the first round, Jordan Downs in Watts, multi-phase development. I think it began really in 2009 or thereabouts. Complicated, complex, addressing a host of benefits and involving literally dozens of players. And I think the scale and breadth of what it takes to pull projects like that and others off really necessitated, I think, or brought forth a lot of the thinking that I think we're trying to raise through the new proposed program, Transformational Climate Communities, where I know one of the intentions, as I mentioned earlier, is to really focus in on local climate action, local partnerships really driving the creation and deployment of projects. And very interested and curious to hear your thoughts and input in the program's formation.
I appreciate all of your responses. Having spent the majority of my own professional career as a professional advocate on the other side of the table, I certainly could sympathize and understand the perspective of having policymakers and policy, once again, identify a core issue, and yet the impacted and the community that we are attempting to influence not being heard or supported or brought to the table, or supported and lifted in such a way that they could actively engage. So I'm glad to hear, because it occurred to me that this is too big and too important to communities across the state to fail. And I wanted to make sure that there was not a disconnect between the administration and communities who have been prioritized in this policy area, in making sure that we are spending the money wisely and in areas that can indeed have the biggest impact for the investment of the buck. And so making sure that you don't have a PR problem, and that you are hearing from communities that have been prioritized as a result of the policy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Great question. Senator Allen.
Hi there. I'm rushing to get a flight down to Los Angeles, but I wanted to ask one question, sort of following up on the last issue that's been raised, and this is specifically to Dr. Kelly. When we're looking at disadvantaged, did I just promote you? Okay, all right.
Different field, but it's okay.
Transportation. You have the...
Your pan knows something about it.
All right. Well, PhD or something. All right. I just wanted to ask about this question of disadvantaged communities as it relates to transit, and do we take into account job centers? Do we think about how disadvantaged communities get to perhaps wealthier communities so they can actually get to, trajectory jobs that will allow them to move up. And one of the biggest issues in Los Angeles, I think, and also to some extent in some of our other cities, is that it's actually some of the urban wealthier areas that are the most congested that end up, lower income people end up spending 2 hours on the bus just to be able to get to those jobs in those areas. And I think it really does impact upper mobility. So could you just comment a little bit on how you think about those kinds of issues in relation to equity and transit access and transit construction?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was just looking at I've got our guidelines in front of me here, and I was just looking at, under the statute that created our program, and I think it's worth noting that the entirety of our program, in terms of the front-end objectives, the evaluation criteria, our process for evaluating is all articulated in statute. So it's both articulated in the law, and then we incorporate it in our guideline process. In addition to the benefits to greenhouse gas emissions and expanding transit ridership availability generally, which are some of our primary evaluation criteria, we're also to look at reducing VMT from automobiles and the number of automobile trips throughout the transit ridership, promoting housing and job centers in the vicinity of rail stations and transit options, increasing the attractiveness of transit-served areas for the location of additional jobs and housing, and the resulting low-carbon impact of such location efficiency statewide on statewide GHG emissions, and then just generally expanding public transit systems for availability for access to mobility. And it seems to me your question gets mostly into that latter issue, is the issue of access to mobility. How are people getting around, and do they have, particularly for transit riders, is it convenient? Is it workable? Is the system a viable option to what might be both inconvenient and expensive driving at times? That's actually, getting a little bit away from cap and trade specifically, that's actually a broader perspective that we're trying to bring to our transit system generally. And what I mean by that is, we call it a broad, rail and transit modernization program, and it involves cleaner technologies and things like that to promote on transit. But we also think that the transit systems have a long way to go in performance, and we want to use state funds to improve the seamlessness, the connectivity, and the viability of transit as an option for all people. So we are actually working with transit operators up and down the state, heading toward our 2018 California Rail Plan that focuses on commuter rail, that will articulate, we think, service improvements up and down the state that will mostly point to more seamless, well-connected, and improved transit systems that I think speak to the core issue for folks who use it.
Okay, I think the point both to you and to my colleagues is that for a lot of the things we've talked about in the context of helping DACs, which I'm very, very supportive of, they could be economic generators in those neighborhoods, stable things. When we're talking about transit, we're talking about moving people. And if all we do is succeed in building lines, within disadvantaged communities, and aren't connecting those disadvantaged communities with the core job centers in our cities and elsewhere, I don't think we've done our disadvantaged communities a big service. And so I just really hope that we're thinking about the realities of commute and access to job opportunities in our cities when we're thinking about the interplay of disadvantaged communities and how they should play out with regards to our funds, and including our cap and trade funds.
Thank you, Senator Goodflight. Senator Pan.
Thank you. I want to thank all the presenters here, and I appreciate your presentations, and particularly a lot of the activities. Appreciate Secretary Ross talking about the ag, and Secretary Laird as well, and about forestry and so forth. And I think those are, certainly good approaches. But since I was called out, I figured I should. I understand that on one hand, yes, and we should think about all the benefits of the different activities. I think it was mentioned, right, for forestry, right? It's not just about carbon sequestrations, many others. But at the same time, I do think in terms of accountability, doesn't mean that we ignore or we don't count those other benefits, but we certainly should overall, as we look at cap and trade, at least in the public's mind, it is about part of it's certainly about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That is clearly an existential issue that the governor has pointed out, as well as many other leaders in Paris and so forth. And so when we look at the evaluation, well, it doesn't mean that we don't say, well, perhaps there's other benefits, but we still should certainly look at the greenhouse gas reduction piece of it, right? And reducing carbon emissions. And so I guess my question is sort of follow up to the discussion with the LAO about saying that as we're looking at these various projects, and they all have great value, and I appreciate your presentations about them, is that we do have, we have benchmarks and we have goals, right? So, and we have those metrics, and I know we need to perhaps engage ARB and so forth. They're not here today, and certainly have that data. But saying that this overall cap and trade program, as well as at least on the some of the individual programs on the larger scale, that we are tracking like what impact it's having on net greenhouse gas emissions, right? And I know you've talked about some of that in your presentations, but I think that is important, an important element, that there's an evaluation with sort of benchmarks. It's not just about monitoring, oh, well, this year we reduced this much and this year we reduced this much, but how are we also matching against what's our goal baseline, right? I mean, we do have a cap on the one hand, but we also, for the cap and trade, but what is that progression that we're going? Are we on goal or not? Are we on track? What are the reasons we are not on track? And if it's technical problems, the research that needs to be done, or new technologies, maybe we need to make adjustments, et cetera, or maybe we're ahead of the track, and that's great too. But I do think that there is still a lack of clarity there. That would be, and that it's important, not just for us as the legislature in terms of oversight, but also our accountability to the general public about what's going on and being sure that the kind of decisions we're making are reaching those goals. And fundamentally, back to the science, right? We do need our carbon to get down. We're not going to drive it alone in California. It's a worldwide problem, but certainly as we're going to, being a leader, we need to show that we're able to do it here in California and to be able to prove it to the rest of the world as well. So I appreciate your response. Thank you.
Let me just for the record say I was being responsive to your concern. I was not calling you out.
No, I agree. No, thank you.
And I think, but that's exactly the point, is I was trying to speak to the exact point you made, is so on forests, we have to, while finance added later that they're all the co-benefits, and I mentioned them,
yeah.
We have to, on the greenhouse gas goals, set a goal, do the program, and measure against the goal. And if there's co-benefits, great, but you have to measure against the basic threshold of whether it sequesters or lowers greenhouse gas emissions, and that is exactly what we're doing. And I think that's the trouble is you hear estimate and you think, geez, that's not lining up for evaluation, but you have to estimate what you think and then measure against it when you actually do it. And I think that's what we're trying to say. Other people can speak to the aggregate, but I sort of think that with all the ones, whether it's wetlands or forests or energy efficiency or water efficiency that fall within the Resources Agency, we're going to do that for each one, and in the aggregate, you'll be able to take them together and then address your question of a baseline and how we're doing across the entire program.
Yeah, I will say that the Air Resources Board is in the process of putting together a new scoping plan that will be looking at how are we doing. I mean, the goal is to get to 431 million metric tons. That's the 1990 level. We're probably at about 459, and so the question is, how are we going to get to that 431? That will be part of the scoping plan. That will then be looking further ahead as well. But we're well aware of the fact that at the end of the day, it's very much a numbers game, and we're working on that and trying to make sure that we're looking at all these programs to see how they're going to add up and how we get the reductions that we need.
Thank you. And I appreciate your leadership, Secretary Laird. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pan. And our last question from Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've been spending a lot of time on disadvantaged communities, and it's a little hard to figure out what that is. So looking at SB 535, it has two definitions or two criteria. One is low income, high unemployment, low levels of home ownership. And I'm just wondering, is that everywhere but Silicon Valley?
We have done, in response to SB 535, we used CalEnviroScreen, which is, CalEnviroScreen looks at 12 environmental factors statewide to see what communities are burdened by.
Got that in point 1, which says, affected by environmental pollution. So how does that differ from greenhouse gases?
What we're looking at, the factors include diesel particulate matter, PM 2.5, ozone, also looks at the water quality in a given area, proximity to hazardous waste facilities. It looks at the full range of environmental challenges for a community. Then it looks
Do
at,
we have a map?
yes, we do.
Okay, great. Where would I find that?
I can make available to you the book, and it's also online if you go to the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, and it will break down by census tract in the state of California where that census tract stands in proximity to other census tracts in California. Both for each individual indicator as well as it provides a cumulative score. Then we use that document in order to identify disadvantaged communities. Cal EPA has been designated with authority to make that identification of disadvantaged communities. And so what we did was we looked at the top 25 scoring census tracts, 25% of those census tracts, and identified them as disadvantaged communities for purposes of implementing SB 535. And as I indicated earlier in my discussion with Senator Leno, we continue to update that to make sure that it is accurate and that we're including new information, because we're trying to get information that's available on a statewide basis. And I'll mention that there are 7 socioeconomic factors that go into the calculation as well, including poverty and educational attainment. So there are a variety of socioeconomic factors that go into it as well.
And then Senator Leno used the word Cal Enviro Screen, and that just blew right past me. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, that is the name that some bright person in OEHA decided to attach to that particular report. I still have some misgivings from time to time, but that's the name of the report. So if you go to the OEHA website and look for Cal Enviro Screen, you will find it there.
Thank you, Secretary Rodriguez. I was just curious, greenhouse gas disperses, right? So it knows no borders. So why are we focused on certain areas? Is it like the LA port or Oakland port or some of these areas?
The concern has been that somehow if you did a cap and trade program, you were going to allow greenhouse gas emissions, which are frequently associated with air pollution, to continue to occur in these areas, because you're providing allowances will allow this air pollution to continue. And somehow that would further disadvantaged communities in California. So what we wanted to do is identify areas in California that were currently disadvantaged, and we will be then keeping track through subsequent versions of Cal Enviro Screen on how they're doing, how are we improving the situation in those communities. I will say that also the governor has instructed the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, which came up with Enviro Screen in the first place, to do an analysis of how AB 32 implementation is affecting disadvantaged communities in California, so we can address this question about whether a cap and trade program perpetuates problems in these communities, or whether we are addressing the problems in those communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Almy, I know that you oversee the court system in the state, and I know that you've been cutting the courts a little bit over the last few years, and that judges are state employees. But let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say that a judge decides that cap and trade is not a tax, and that the money that was collected was not supposed to have been, and it has to be reimbursed. Are we prepared for that?
I'm not sure. I think we have a pretty strong confidence that the state would win in court. I would say that what the reimbursement would have to be under a worst-case scenario would depend on what the court rules. And I think that this argues for why the Department of Finance supports a strong and healthy reserve even in good times, because there are uncertainties. And so, so to just underscore the 2 points, I think that we're confident in our ability to win in court, but we support a strong and healthy reserve to prepare for all types of uncertainties.
Excuse me, and Secretary Rodriguez, we're looking at 1990 levels. We're trying to get down to those levels, but we also have theoretically an expanding population, internal growth, internal migration. Maybe we've got outgoing migration, but it seems to be holding. How do you grow a state but also try to reach levels from 1990? Is that possible, or am I?
We'd like to think that it is possible, yes. The projection actually was that if we went ahead on a business as usual projection, we would be up over 500 million metric tons in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 if that had proceeded. The fact that we flattened out and we're seeing reductions indicates that we are being successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then we continue to look at the California economy, which is, if we were our own country, would be the eighth, or on a good, really good day, the seventh largest economy in the world, and we continue to monitor the effect on the economy. You had a question earlier today about manufacturing, so we keep an eye on manufacturing jobs to make sure that, that the program doesn't have a detrimental effect on manufacturing. And if we see an impact, we're prepared to consider, are there changes that we should make in the allowances? Are there more free allowances that we should be giving? So it is a matter of constantly monitoring the impact of the program on the economy. But on the whole, what we see is that the California economy is doing well, progressing better than other portions of the country, and yet we're seeing the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But I've had to move beyond my comfort zone in the legal profession to become a closet economist recently, and I spend a great deal of time looking at the economic factors to make sure that we can continue to reach our goals by 2020 while not harming, and in fact, we hope helping the California economy.
No, thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can add.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Laird.
You knew.
You can just talk to Senator Pan, but don't.
Well, I'm about to call you out. The thing that I would add to Secretary Rodriguez's account that goes right to your question is, in your part of the world, south of the Tehachapi's, since 1990, there have been roughly 4 or 5 million more people, and they're using less water than they were at the start of that period. So there's been an accommodation of growth of over 4 million people through the efficiency that exists, and for the purposes of greenhouse gas reductions, energy is very much tied to water use. So you can just look at a practical case in your region where people have actually set a goal and they have met it, and the growth has been handled by their efficiency, and they're actually using less than they were at the time that period started. So it's a perfect proof of what Secretary Rodriguez was talking about.
And it is the full toolbox of approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. So as we become more energy efficient, that allows us to incorporate new businesses and citizens into California, but that's offset by the fact that we're improving in energy efficiency, that we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions by getting our energy from cleaner sources. So it's a balance, and we're constantly looking at the interrelationship between the whole suite of programs that we have here in California.